The signal came from somewhere. It had no right to exist. Yara heard it before the others did, a low, rhythmic pulse riding the static like a heartbeat that refused to stop. She pressed 2 fingers to the speaker housing of the relay pack and felt it vibrate against her skin, that particular frequency that the Conclave's analysts had mapped as the human distress band. 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short. They had been broadcasting it on loop for 11 days before anyone in the 7th Recon Division bothered to listen. She was the one who had bothered. That was, she suspected, why she was still crouching in the back of the transport instead of standing with the others at the briefing table. Commander Vethka did not particularly want Yara anywhere near the front of the room. He had made this plain without words, the way officers always did, by arranging the team in a half-circle around the holographic map and allowing the gap where she would have stood to simply remain a gap, a negative space in the shape of her, a polite absence. She was used to gaps. Yara was 23 standard cycles old, which in human terms would have made her roughly 27. She was Orc lower caste Orc, which was to say that she carried the gray mark, the pale scar pattern that latticed the left side of her jaw and throat like frozen lightning, a thing she had been born with and had never been permitted to forget. It had been there at birth. Her mother had not named it a blessing. The village midwife had gone quiet in that particular way that meant she was deciding whether to say the thing out loud. She had not said it out loud, but she had not needed to. Yara had learned the word for herself by the time she was old enough to read her own name on a school register. Cursed. In the 37th century of the Conclave, being Orc was not shameful. Being lower caste Orc was not shameful. Being gray-marked lower caste Orc was not shameful either, technically, according to the 4,000 amendments to the Conclave's Charter of Racial Dignity, which had been ratified over 600 years of incremental legal progress, and which sat in the official archive like a monument to how long it took a civilization to say something it had always known. Technically was a word that did a great deal of labor in the Charter. It held up the distance between what the Conclave professed and what its systems, its habits, its unspoken arrangements actually produced. In practice, she had been assigned to 7th Recon because 7th Recon was where soldiers went when someone needed them gone. Not killed, just gone, out of the way. On missions that required warm bodies of no particular consequence, in places that did not show up on news feeds, doing work that the Conclave's formal military structure needed done, but did not need to acknowledge doing. The kind of missions where it was acceptable to lose a scout or two and still file the operation as a success, where the casualty line in the official report said something bureaucratic, and the gap in the personnel roster closed itself within a standard rotation. She was, by the squad's unspoken consensus, the scout they could afford to lose. Vethka was talking. She watched him from her perch on the cargo netting at the back of the transport bay, his broad warrior caste jaw moving, his hands tracing lines across the hologram with the unhurried authority of someone who had been given rooms to fill for his entire adult life and had never had to think about whether he deserved them. He was Orc too, but warrior caste, which meant his skin carried the deep copper sheen of a bloodline that had never been cursed, never been hungry, never sat in the back of a transport while the briefing happened without them. His gray mark was decorative, a tattoo etched in the ritual fashion, placed exactly where Yara's birthmark sat, because it had become fashionable in certain elite units to wear the sign of the cursed as an affectation. A gesture of solidarity, some called it. An acknowledgement of shared heritage, others said. She had stared at that tattoo for 6 weeks now, and had decided not to let it make her angry. She had decided this approximately 900 times. The 901st time she would probably have to decide it again, and she had accepted this as a feature of her situation rather than a problem to be solved. Facility is designated Research Station Corvus 9, Vethka said. Human installation, subterranean, built into a sea cliff shelf on a classified island in the northern archipelago, not on any public conclave map, We're told it was running biomedical experiments under conclave treaty exemption, which means nobody was looking very closely at what they were actually doing down there. He paused in the way commanders pause to let a significant fact settle before they moved past it. 11 days ago, they sent a distress signal. The team exchanged looks. Draws, the demolition specialist, a broad-shouldered soldier with a face like a toolbox that had been dropped repeatedly, cracked his knuckles with the sound of someone who processed tension through noise. Pell, the field medic, pulled at the hem of her glove with the focused attention of someone who wanted to appear unconcerned and was not succeeding entirely. Get and Rorn, the two marksmen, simply stood the way marksmen always stood, like they were already aiming at something in the middle distance that no one else could see. We go in, we extract whatever data they were working on, we extract any survivors if there are any, and we seal the station. Vethka clicked off the hologram. The light in the transport bay shifted back to the dull, institutional amber of standby mode. Protocol 17 applies. If we encounter contamination beyond first stage parameters, we apply paragraph 78. Paragraph 78 was the conclave military code for a contained elimination order. It meant that if the infection had spread beyond containment parameters, the squad's secondary objective, the elimination of all infected vectors, superseded the primary one. It meant that the survivors ceased to be survivors in any operationally relevant sense. It meant that what the squad found below, they would assess, and then, if assessment dictated it, leave behind sealed inside a facility that would be deactivated and flagged and forgotten. Nobody looked at Yara. She was looking at the floor and thinking about the 11 days between the signal and the response, and what it meant that 11 days had passed, and what kind of system produces that particular gap. The descent through the ventilation shaft of Corvus 9 took 40 minutes. The station had been built into the rock shelf of the sea cliff, which meant the shaft was cold and smelled of brine and old circuitry, and the particular mineral damp of enclosed geology, the smell of the Earth's memory of water, layered and deep. Yara was second in the column behind Draws because Vethka had placed her there, close enough to be useful if Draws went down, far enough back that she would eat the pressure wave if Draws triggered a proximity mine. She noted this and filed it away next to the other things she was not going to let make her angry. The file was getting full. The shaft opened into a maintenance corridor 6 meters below the station's primary access level. Emergency lighting painted the walls amber. The team spread out without speaking, fanning into positions with the economy of motion that came from years of working together. A choreography Yara had spent 6 weeks trying to read without ever quite cracking the deeper grammar of it. She was fluent in the tactical language, the signals, the spacing, the way weight shifted when a unit was preparing for contact. But there was a layer beneath the tactics, a texture of shared history, in-jokes run dry into ritual, and mutual knowledge accumulated across missions she had not been part of. That layer remained closed to her. She moved in the gaps of it, professional and uninvited. She noticed the coffee mug first. It was sitting on a shelf beside a monitoring station at the junction of the main corridor and a side passage half full, the liquid surface gone opaque with cold. Next to it, a folded piece of paper. She unfolded it quietly while the others swept the far end of the corridor and Vethka held the junction. A child's drawing in crayon. 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, and a lumpy yellow shape between them that might have been a dog or might have been a son or might have been a dog that looked like a son because the artist was 6 years old, and certain technical distinctions were not yet mandatory. At the bottom, in the looping handwritten script that humans used for informal communication, a line in their northern dialect. For Daddy from Lena, age 6. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she folded it back exactly the way it had been and left it on the shelf. The corridor led to a junction. Vethka signaled a split, Get and Rorn east toward the laboratory wing, Draws south toward the reactor and maintenance levels, Pell and Yara north toward the medical bay. Vethka himself would hold the junction and coordinate. Standard grid sweep. 20 minutes back to junction assess. Pell glanced at Yara once as they moved north, quickly. The look of a person who has been paired with someone they did not choose and is running the calculation of how to handle the next 20 minutes. Pell was warrior caste, lower ranked than the specialists, with the particular combination of competence and frustration that came from doing essential work in a role the caste system had historically undervalued. Yara had once overheard Pell complaining about the medic's status to Rorn in a tone that suggested she understood, at least partially, what it meant to be undervalued by a system that benefited from your being undervalued. It was the closest Yara had come to feeling something like kinship with her in 6 weeks. They moved north in silence. The medical bay was at the end of a 20-meter corridor that turned once and then opened into a wide room with examination tables, storage units, diagnostic equipment, and the layered smell of a medical facility. Antiseptic and biological, and something underneath both of those that Yara could not immediately name. Something cellular. Something that was almost living but not quite. The way a laboratory smells when it has been working on something that does not want to be worked on. Pell swept the examination tables. Yara swept the storage units. Both were empty in the straightforward sense. No personnel, no movement, no immediate threat. Then Pell stopped. On the far wall, scratched into the pale institutional paint with what looked like a surgical tool, methodical, deliberate, the lines of someone who had made a decision about what they were doing and then done it carefully were lines of text. Human script. The northern dialect same as the drawing. Yara translated slowly. Her human language training was functional but not elegant, the kind of competence that got you through a mission rather than through a conversation, the kind where you sometimes reached for words and found them half a second late and slightly off shade. Day 3. Containment failed on sublevel 2. The lower core sections are compromised. Arkhipov says we can still seal the lower corridors if we work through the night. Myra disagrees. I think Myra is right, but I'm not saying it because Arkhipov is the one who decides who gets on the elevator, and I have not yet decided whether my honesty is worth more than my position on that list. Day 5. Elevator is locked. Arkhipov has the codes. Myra tried to take them from him last night. I don't know where Myra is now. Nobody is saying. Day 7. There are 11 of us left above sublevel 2. We can hear it below, not screaming anymore. Something worse than screaming. Something that used to be screaming and has run out of energy and is still trying. I keep thinking about my daughter. I left her drawing on the shelf in Corridor C so I wouldn't lose it in case things got, in case I needed to move quickly. I left it where I would have put anything I wanted someone to find later. Yara stood very still for a moment. She was aware of Pell reading over her shoulder. She was aware of the precise moment when Pell stopped reading and looked at her instead, with an expression that was trying to be professionally neutral and was only partly managing it. He left it on purpose, Yara said. The drawing, he left it on purpose in a place someone would find it, in case. Pell didn't answer immediately. She turned and began cataloging the pharmaceutical stores, which was the medic's way of not engaging with something she did not want to engage with, an escape into task. Yara did not push it. She copied the wall text into her mission log, all of it, including the final entry, which was the briefest. Day 9. I have decided not to die afraid. I'm not sure I'm going to succeed. The gap between deciding something and doing it is where most of your life happens, but I've decided to try, and trying is somewhere to be. The regrouping at the junction came 20 minutes later. They filed the sweep reports in the economic shorthand of a unit that has learned to debrief quickly. Ged and Rorn had found the laboratory wing, ransacked. 5 containment units breached with the seals peeled back from the inside. 2 more with the seals damaged externally. the atmosphere scrubbers running on backup power at 30% capacity. Draws had found the reactor stable, but constrained, running on reduced output in a configuration that required manual adjustment. Not a failure, a deliberate setting. Someone had manually reduced the power draw to extend the backup system's operational window. Someone was trying to slow it down, Draws said. His voice had the flat quality it got when he was processing something that did not fit his previous model of a situation. The reactor's not failing. It was set this way. Someone bought maybe 6, 8 additional days of partial containment by limiting the draw. It didn't work, Vethka said. No, it didn't work. Draws looked at the junction floor, but they tried. Vethka received this as information. He processed it with the commander's ability to take facts and move immediately to their tactical implications without lingering in their human weight. It was a useful skill. Yara had once admired it, in the early weeks when she had still been studying the team the way she studied everything, carefully, looking for the pattern. Now, watching Vethka's face, she found herself wondering what that skill cost on the inside, whether there was a room somewhere behind the tactical mask where things accumulated that had not been processed, whether the room was full. Sublevel 2, he said, we go down. The elevator was locked, as the wall text had recorded. Payak, the squad's technical specialist, a young conclave-born orc of no marked caste, who communicated primarily through gestures at the terminal interface, and who had the focused calm of someone who had found their one true skill early and built their entire relationship with the world around it, worked the lock bypass for approximately 4 minutes. The elevator was an older model, pre-reform, and its security architecture had the particular rigidity of systems that had been designed when threats were external rather than internal. It had not been built to assume that the facility it was protecting might need to keep its own people in. The doors ground open. The elevator descended with a sound like reluctance made mechanical. The doors opened onto darkness. Not the amber darkness of the upper levels, where the emergency lighting was doing its minimal job. Absolute darkness. The kind that emergency lighting had given up on, or that something had given up on the emergency lighting. Vethka signaled, and the team activated tactical illumination, low-spectrum headsets that painted everything in the gray-white of an overexposed photograph, stripping color and leaving only edge and shadow and the flat geometry of enclosed space. The corridor below was not empty. They came from the side corridor to the east, and from a maintenance shaft to the north, and from a door that had been half prized off its hinges from the inside. And they moved the way things move when something fundamental about their movement has been overwritten. Not the fluid articulation of a body that knows where it is going, but the lurching insistence of a body that has been stripped of intention and left with only the drive to move. There were 9 of them. What remained of their clothing identified them as station personnel, research staff in lab coats, maintenance workers in gray overalls, one figure in a physician's coat with a name badge still clipped to the lapel. Their eyes tracked light, their mouths were open. The sound they made was not screaming. It was something that had been screaming once, something that had run out of the capacity for screaming and was still producing the motion of it without the sound. A silent, open-mouthed repetition of a distress signal that had nothing left to transmit. Yara had been briefed on the virus. She had read the analyst's file on the transport, the dry technical language of a classified report describing pathogen vectors and infection timelines and behavioral modification outcomes. She had thought she understood what weaponized biomodification looked like in a controlled clinical description. She had not understood. The team opened fire with the controlled efficiency of soldiers who have trained for contact since adolescence. Short bursts, maintained spacing, Get and Rorn pulling the wide angles while Draws covered the rear approach and Pell stayed at Vethka's shoulder with her trauma kit and her sidearm both ready. 8 seconds. It was over in 8 seconds. It was clean. It was professional. It was the kind of work that gets easier over time, which is itself a kind of cost that the mission reports do not record. Vethkai stepped forward to confirm elimination. Standard protocol. He moved through the fallen with the methodical attention of someone applying a procedure he has applied many times. The figure in the physician's coat was not dead. It was lying on the floor at the far end of the corridor, and it was damaged in ways that Yara's medical training told her should have been fatal, had been fatal, in the technical sense, in the sense that the damage was not survivable by any standard biological measure. But it was not finished. It was looking up at Vethka with an expression that was not readable through the damage the virus had written across its face, but whose eyes were tracking. The eyes were focused. They were moving with deliberate attention between Vethka's face and the space beyond him, searching. Its hand moved. Slowly, with enormous effort, joints working against the resistance of a body that had been compromised at the structural level, each movement clearly costing something that was not going to be repaid. It moved toward Vethka's boot. Not attacking. Reaching. Yara was already moving before she had decided to move. This was a thing she had learned about herself over the course of her life, that her body sometimes reached the correct interpretation of a situation faster than her analytical mind did, that the gap between those two speeds was occasionally the whole distance between a good outcome and a disaster. She stepped between Vethka and the reaching hand, and she crouched down, and she took the hand in both of hers. It gripped her, weakly, with barely any force. But the grip was deliberate, fingers closing around her fingers with the specific focused effort of a hand that was choosing to hold on, not simply responding to contact. Vethka said her name, one syllable flat, command-shaped. She's communicating, Yara said. She did not know exactly how she knew this, the same way she had known the drawing was left on purpose, the same way she had known the reactor shutdown was deliberate. Through the accumulation of evidence of a person making choices, small choices, impossible choices, the kind that only make sense if someone is still there making them. Yara, his hand moved to his sidearm. The motion was not threatening so much as reflexive, the gesture of someone running through their train sequence and finding the next step in it. She has information. Yara kept her gaze on the physician's face. The woman's eyes had found her now, had settled on her with the focus of someone working with a severely limited budget of time and attention, and allocating every unit of it carefully. What happened here was not an accident. Someone triggered this deliberately. This woman may be one of the last people alive who knows who. Pell said very quietly from somewhere behind Yara's left shoulder, "She's right." The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Vethka held the sidearm at low ready. He was running the calculation, the tactical calculation, the risk-benefit matrix, the probability assessment. She could see it moving across his face the way weather moves across a landscape, visible even if you can't see the mechanism. Probability of actionable information, probability of contamination risk, probability that this was a threat posture she was misreading, probability that this was something else entirely. 2 minutes, he said finally. If she can communicate in 2 minutes, we hear it. If she cannot, we apply the protocol and move. Yara turned back to the physician. Up close, beneath the damage the virus had layered across her body, she was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of face that had clearly once looked younger than its age, faint laugh lines, cautious hands with the calluses of someone who worked with tools that required precision. A person who had spent their life being careful. "Can you tell me what happened here?" Yara asked. In human language, her accent was bad. The consonants came out with the Orc dental structure's characteristic softening. She knew it sounded wrong to a native ear. She said it anyway clearly, looking at the physician's eyes so the woman could read her attention as genuine even if the diction was imperfect. The physician's mouth moved. What came out was fragmented, halting, roughened by the virus but not destroyed. a voice that had been reduced to its fundamental architecture and was using what was left. Not accident, deployment. Someone in the chain authorized it. Corvus 9 was selected. The population here was selected. We were the test population. They needed to test the pathogen in a live environment with real containment protocols and real medical response data. We were the test. Yara's hands tightened. I have authorization codes in my coat pocket, left interior. Take them. Take them and pull the chain. Find who signed the order. Someone will know what to do with it if you take it to the right person. I spent the last 2 days hoping someone would come. Someone with clearance, and she paused, eyes flickering to Yara's marked jaw and reason to care what happens to the people who got left behind. Yara reached into the pocket with her free hand. The coat had been a physician's coat once, white, and was not white anymore, and the pocket was in the left interior where the woman had said, and in it was a data chip, small and flat, the standard conclave intelligence storage format, engraved on one corner with a designation code she did not recognize. She held it up. The physician looked at the chip, then looked at Yara. Whatever the expression was under the damage, it was not afraid. The eyes were clear, focused, pointed at a task that was almost finished. The grip on Yara's hand shifted, not tightening, softening. The way a grip softens when the thing it was holding on for has been accomplished. Yara held her hand until the eyes stopped tracking. Then she stood and turned to Veth Ka and held up the chip between 2 fingers, steady, the way you present evidence. Deployment, she said, not outbreak. Someone in the chain of command triggered the pathogen release deliberately. This station and its population were selected as a live test environment. The authorization for this is on this chip. She watched his face. Watched the tactical mask do its work. Watched something underneath the mask doing slower, harder work alongside it. If that chain leads where I think it leads, the people who sent us here may be the same people who sent the weapon. The silence had weight now. It pressed against the walls of the sublevel corridor, the way water presses against a sealed door. Draaz said, if that's true. I know what it means, Veth Ka said. Do you? Draaz's voice was not challenging. It was genuinely asking. Because if the authorization comes from inside the oversight board. I know what it means. Get and Rorn had not spoken. They were standing with weapons at low ready, the posture of trained soldiers whose bodies have not yet decided whether the threat is in front of them or behind them, or at their left shoulder, in the form of a chain of command that may have already decided how this mission ends. Veth Ka held out his hand for the chip. Yara did not give it to him. The moment stretched. She was fully aware of what she was doing, aware of the command structure, the mission parameters, the precise weight of insubordination in a live operation. She was aware that Veth Ka outranked her by several magnitudes, and had the legal authority to take the chip, and the legal authority to apply the protocol, and the legal authority to write the after-action report that would determine how all of this was described to the people who received after-action reports, and decided what they meant. She was also aware of the gray mark on his jaw, the copy, the tattoo, the fashionable gesture, and of her own, and of the 23 years between them, and of the 4,000 amendments, and of the word technically. I'll carry it, she said. Until we know who's on the other end of that authorization trail, I'll carry it. If it leads nowhere or leads to something that clears the chain, I hand it in at debrief, and we file the mission as written. If it leads where I think it leads, we need a chain of custody that doesn't run through the same structure that may have signed the order. She watched him decide. He could have taken it from her, physically without effort, legally without consequence to himself. She had left him the room to do it. She had stated her reasoning clearly so that if he was the kind of person who could hear reasoning in a situation like this, he would have received it, and if he was not, she would know that too, and it would matter. He stepped back. Move out, he said. Upper level, we're not done. They were not done. The ascent through the facility was different from the descent in the way all returns differ from approaches. You move through the same space, but you are not the same person who entered it, and the space knows this and responds accordingly. The amber corridors felt more cramped on the way back. The details that had been data on the way in, the mug, the drawing, the scratched text, the smell of the medical bay, had become something else. Something with weight. Something that wanted to be carried. The upper level had not stayed quiet. 3 infected personnel had moved from somewhere deeper in the facility into the primary corridor, and they were between the team and the egress junction, moving with the same driven purposelessness as the ones below. Get and Rorn handled them without ceremony. The corridor was clear in 40 seconds. The elevator shaft access had been blocked, not mechanically broken. Something had jammed itself into the gap between the doors during their time below, something that had once been the station's systems engineer based on the tool belt still looped around what was left of his waist. The doors could not seal with him there. They could not open fully either. The mechanism was caught between its 2 states, grinding against itself, producing a sound like infrastructure becoming confused. Draws assessed the doors with the quick professional appraisal of a man who spent his life thinking about the ways materials failed. Pell assessed the approaches. Yara moved to Payok's shoulder as he pulled out the terminal interface and began reading the door mechanism's diagnostic feed. 30 seconds, Payok said. His voice was always this even, not cold, not detached, simply precise. He was one of those people whose panic, if it existed, ran somewhere entirely internal and left the surface completely undisturbed. Yara had initially read this as coldness, and had spent the 6 weeks revising the interpretation toward something more like a coping architecture that looked different from the outside than it felt from the inside. We may not have 30 seconds, Get said from the east angle. 28 seconds, Payok said. 2 more infected emerged from the eastern branch at 25 seconds, moving fast, faster than the ones below had moved, either less advanced in the infection's progression or simply fresher, more recently turned. Get and Rorn dropped the first. The second came from a ceiling collapse, through a tile that had been failing since before the outbreak, judging by the water staining around it, dropping with the momentum of a body that had stopped calculating self-preservation as a variable. Yara caught it on the blade. Not with a weapon drawn in sequence. With the knife already in her hand, which was in her hand because her hand had made a decision before she had consciously made it, and the decision was correct, and the corridor was clear. She stood and wiped the blade and looked at Vethka, who was looking at her with the expression he had been using for 3 days now, the one that was recalibrating. Done, Payok said. The elevator doors ground open. The ascent was slow and close. 7 people in a space meant for 4, the kind of proximity that strips the professional distance out of a unit and leaves the humans underneath. Draws was bleeding above his eye minor. Pell was already addressing it with the economical efficiency of someone who has dressed this specific type of wound 100 times. Get and Rorn ran the post-contact check with the rhythm of a litany. Payok stared at the elevator panel with the specific expression of a technician who is mentally reviewing what he just did to make sure it was right. Vethka was looking at Yara. The physician, he said, you read her as capable of intentional communication. Yes. And you were correct. Yes. He was quiet for the rest of the ascent. She watched him think and did not interrupt it. The maintenance corridor at the top was the same amber light, the same brine smell, the same emergency functionality of a facility that had been designed to survive on minimum resources. They moved toward the egress shaft without speaking, the team's collective silence having become a different kind of silence from the operational quiet of the entry. This one full rather than empty, weighted rather than watchful. Yara was the last one to the shaft. She paused at the entrance and looked back down the corridor one more time. The coffee mug was still on the shelf. The drawing was still folded beside it. The scratched text was still on the wall of the medical bay somewhere north of where she stood. the careful handwriting of a person spending their last coherent days recording what had happened so that whoever came after would know. She thought about the physician's name badge, still clipped to the coat. She had not read it. She thought about going back and reading it, so she would have a name to put with the face when she filed the mission log, so the physician would be a person in the official record, rather than an unnamed infected contact who had been classified and moved past. She did not have time to go back. She filed it in the same place as all the other things she intended to return to. They emerged on the surface. The sky above the island was the color of pewter, pre-dawn. The light that happens before dawn admits it's happening. The transport was on the pad where they'd left it, running on standby power, the pilot inside with the face of someone who has been composing professional calm for 6 hours and is ready to stop composing it. All accounted for? The pilot asked. Veth Ka confirmed. 7. His eyes moved to Yara as he said the number, and the movement was not the accident of a random glance. It was noting. Yara was the last one up the ramp. She turned and looked back at the sealed surface entry of Corvus 9 for a moment. The hatch set into the cliff face, gray against gray, looking like it had always been there and had always been sealed and had never contained anything at all. She turned and got into the transport and held the data chip in her closed fist the entire flight back. The debrief took place in a secure facility that existed in the official roster as a logistics coordination hub, and in practice as an intelligence processing center for operations that generated complications. The room smelled of recycled air, and the particular tension of a space where information was controlled, and the controlling of it was itself controlled. Vasadrim was the debrief officer, a conclave intelligence liaison with a face that had learned early how to present a smooth surface over whatever machinery ran beneath it, and the patience of someone who understood that silence was a tool. Veth Ka gave the mission account. Verbal, precise, accurate. He described the facility, the scope of the outbreak, the infected personnel, the evidence of deliberate pathogen deployment that the team had observed in the laboratory wing, and the reactor configuration, and the communications they had intercepted and recorded. He did not mention the data chip. Yara understood this as she had understood the drawing on the shelf as a deliberate act, a positioning. He was leaving a space in the account. He was creating a gap for a reason. The debrief proceeded. Questions were asked and answered. When Vasadrim reached Yara, she answered directly, without elaboration or withholding, describing the physician's communication and its content and the chip and her decision to carry it. Vasadrim listened with the precise attention of someone cataloging everything. Then she held out her hand. Yara looked at Veth Ka. He looked at the table, not as an abdication, as a signal. The calculation had run. He was showing her where it had landed. She gave the chip to Vasadrim. Vasadrim turned it over once. Her expression remained the smooth, controlled surface. She set it on the table in front of her. "This concludes the formal debrief," she said. "You're dismissed." 3 days later, a senior member of the Conclave Military Oversight Board was taken into custody. He was not the only one. The investigation that the chip's authorization trail opened ran through 11 months of careful procedural work. The kind of work that happens in rooms Yara would never have clearance to enter, documented in reports that would be classified for decades, and ultimately implicated 4 members of the Oversight Board, 2 attached civilian contractors who had handled the pathogen's development budget, and a senior biosciences administrator who had been running off-ledger experimental protocols under the protection of Paragraph 78's authority to classify all evidence obtained during quarantine operations. The victims of Corvus 9 were confirmed at 73 individuals: research scientists, maintenance workers, 3 station physicians, administrative staff. One of them had been a man named Valentin Fedorov, 41 years old, senior atmospheric technician, who had spent the last days of his life reducing the reactor output to extend the backup systems and scratching his account into the wall and leaving a drawing his daughter had made on a shelf in Corridor C so he wouldn't lose it. Yara read the tribunal records when they were released to restricted access. She read them in a small room in the 7th Recon Barracks, sitting on her bunk with her back against the wall, going through each name with the same attention she had given the signal, one at a time, in order. She did not read them as a victory. She had thought about what word applied here and had not found one that fit. Victory implied that the outcome was better than the alternative, which was true, but did not capture what the outcome had cost before she arrived. She had answered a signal that had been broadcasting for 11 days. She had heard what the signal was saying. She had carried what needed to be carried to the place where it could do something. What she had done was not enough to have prevented what happened, but it was enough to ensure it was not forgotten, and it was enough to ensure that the people who had written it into the world could not also write how the world was permitted to understand it. She read them as a responsibility. The responsibility of being the person who noticed, the drawing, the grip, the gap in the verbal account, the 11 days of an unanswered signal. Being the person who did not decide in advance what a thing meant before looking at it. Being the person who looked. The barracks door opened. Vethka stood in the frame, out of uniform. She had only ever seen him in the formal attire of command. Without it, he looked like a person who had been doing very hard thinking for 3 days and had not entirely finished. He sat on the bench across from her bunk. He looked at the tribunal records on her screen. He did not speak immediately. She did not require him to. "I read them too," he said. "I know. I saw the access log." He looked at her with the recalibrating expression, the one that had been developing since the corridor below. "I made the original recommendation when you were first assigned. I reviewed your file and designated you acceptable loss based on caste, the gray mark, the pattern that training builds into assessment until you can't see it as a pattern anymore. You know this. I've always known. I'm telling you because you should know I know it, not because knowing it changes what it was." He said this without the softening of an apology, which she found she respected more than the softening would have been. Apologies for structural things had a way of centering the person offering them. "You filed me as full team member in the preliminary report," she said. "Before this conversation." "Yes." "Before you decided to tell me." "Yes." "So you did it because the assessment had changed, not as amends." He considered this. Both. The assessment changed first. The amends followed from the changed assessment. I'm not asking you to treat those as equivalent. She looked at the gray mark in the small mirror on the opposite wall, the pale lattice of it catching the low barrack light. 23 years of it. Born with it, named for what it was said to mean, fitted into the gap it created in every room she had entered, performing acceptable loss for an institution that had decided before she arrived what she was worth. "The tattoo," she said. He reached up and touched the jaw. He did not explain it. He looked at it as she had, as a thing that had cost nothing, and had borrowed the shape of something that cost everything, and he did not defend it. The silence around the gesture was the most honest thing he had managed yet. "What happens to 7th Recon?" she asked. "I'm leaving it. The tribunal recommended a new oversight position for the Conclave's bioweapons protocol. Mandate is to review every operation that invokes paragraph 78 and trace the authorization chain before the protocol is applied." He looked at her. "I said I would take the position if I could staff it with personnel I selected." "You're selecting me." "I'm offering you Scout Commander track, full authority over tactical assessments and mission intelligence. The position requires someone who reads a situation rather than pattern matching it against existing assessments. Someone who asks whether the parameters were written in good faith before deciding whether the parameters apply." He held her gaze. Someone who notices what a physician is trying to do with the last available minutes of deliberate cognition. The wind pushed at the barracks roof. The soldier in the next bunk breathed deeply in the dense unconsciousness of someone who had learned to sleep in every gap between things. Yara thought about the signal. 11 days on loop, 3 short pulses, 3 long, 3 short. A station full of people trying to be heard by a civilization that had 11 days to listen and did not listen until she made it listen. She thought about what it meant to be essential. Not whether she believed it. Belief had never been the operative question. The operative question was always whether she was doing the work, and the work was always the same. Look at what is there. Read it as it is. Carry it to where it can do something. She looked at the gray mark in the mirror one more time. "Tell me about the work," she said. Veth Ka began to speak, and she listened with the full attention she had given the signal, unguarded, present, not deciding in advance what the next thing said would mean. Somewhere above the clouds, over the sea, over the sealed hatch of Corvus 9, and the corridor with the drawing on the shelf, and the scratched text on the wall of the medical bay, the dawn was completing itself. It had been completing itself for hours. It did not require acknowledgement to proceed. The signal had been answered. It had been answered by the scout they had sent along, because she was expendable. She was still here. She had always been the kind of person who was still here. Veth Ka's briefing was thorough, the kind built by someone who had spent decades learning how to present information and was now learning, for the first time, how to present it honestly. The new position had no name yet in the official registry. It had a mandate, review, trace, question, and a budget, and a blank chart waiting for personnel that would not be filled by whoever was easiest to justify losing. She asked questions, he answered them. The work was the kind of work that happened far from combat zones, in rooms with access logs and documentation requirements, and the slow procedural weight of institutional accountability, which was its own kind of fight, and its own kind of exhaustion, and its own kind of thing that needed doing by someone with the patience to do it carefully. "You'll have a staff," he said. 3 analysts, 2 field liaisons. You can bring your own if you have people. She thought about Payok, about the even voice and the terminal interface and the precise calm of a person who had found the one skill that explained the world to them and had never stopped using it. About Pell, with her medic's calluses and her occasional slips of something that looked like understanding when she thought no one was watching. "I have people," she said. Veth Ka nodded. He had not expected anything different, which she noted as a change. He was not surprised by her competence anymore, and the not being surprised was itself something new, a recalibrated default where her capability was the thing he was building from rather than the thing he was conceding. Small but not trivial. First operation will be a review of the paragraph 78 applications from the last 6 years, he said. There are 43. Most will be clean, but if Corvus 9 is not the only one. It won't be, Yara said. He looked at her. Someone who deploys a pathogen to test containment protocols does not do it once, she said. The data Corvus 9 generated was going somewhere. It was feeding something. There will be more if we look for them, and they will have been sealed the same way, and the people inside them will have been designated the same way. She looked at the tribunal records still open on her screen. 73 names. Acceptable loss. The words sat between them. He had used them about her, 2 years ago, in a file review she had never been meant to read, but that had found its way to her, the way files found their way to people who paid attention to where information moved. He did not flinch from them. Then we look for them, he said, and we find them and we name them. He looked at the screen. All of them. She closed the tribunal file. She had not finished reading it, would not finish it tonight, or perhaps in many nights. 73 was not a number that resolved quickly, but she had read enough for now. Enough to know that the work ahead was not small and was not clean and would not feel like victory when it was done, because it was the kind of work whose only honest reward was that you had done it. She stood. The gray mark caught the light. She let it. "When do we start?" she asked. "Yesterday," Vethka said. "But we work with what we have." She thought this was probably the most honest thing he had said to her since she'd been assigned to his unit, which was either a low bar or the beginning of a higher one, and she suspected the difference would be determined by what they did next. "Then let's start now," she said. And she walked out of the barrack room, past the sleeping soldiers and the recycled air and the low barrack light, into the corridor, where the dawn was still happening somewhere above everything, and the work was still waiting to be done, and she was still the person who had decided to do it, and that decision had been made so many times now that it had stopped feeling like a decision and started feeling like a direction. She went in the direction. She had always gone in the direction. That was the thing they had never understood about her. Not the commanders, not the caste system, not the 4,000 amendments and their patient technically, not the midwife who had gone quiet. None of them had understood that the gray mark was not a curse because curses required an outside force to apply them, and what Yara carried had not been applied from outside. It had been born into her the same way the capacity to notice had been born into her, the same way the willingness to crouch beside a dying woman and take her hand and hear what she needed to say had been born into her. It was hers. All of it was hers. The signal had been broadcasting for 11 days. She had been the one who listened. She had always been that person. She would be that person in every room they put her in, whether the room was the back of a transport or a sub-level corridor or an oversight position in a newly created conclave review body. She would notice the drawing on the shelf and the deliberate grip of a finishing hand, and the gap in a verbal account where something important had been left out on purpose. She would carry what needed carrying. She would name what needed naming. She walked into the morning with the gray mark on her jaw and the data chip's chain of custody filed correctly, and the names of 73 people held in the specific way you hold something that costs you something to hold, not lightly, not with the false peace of having resolved it, but with the weight it deserved, which was the only honest way to carry it. The dawn above the clouds was cold and vast and continuing. She walked into it.